Okay, welcome. Again, my name is Avery, and I'm going to be doing some introductions and introducing our speakers for today. We are really glad to have you join us. Our topic today is pandemic update. How are skills and the economy shifting? But first, if it's your first time with us, I want to talk a little bit about Chmura and why we're talking about skills and the economy. So Chmura is a company that provides labor market data and analysis so that you can make informed decisions that help your community thrive, whether you're in education or workforce, economic development, or site selection. At Chmura, we believe you shouldn't have to get a PhD in economics to understand your local economy. So we were founded in 1998 by Dr. Chris Chmura, who will be one of our speakers today. And now we have offices both in Richmond and in Cleveland. And what we do is at Chmura, we help people understand their local economies with our data, our software, and our consulting. Many of you may be our JobsEQ software clients, and what JobsEQ does is gives you all of the labor market data and analysis you need to perform your own analysis of your workforce. And on the consulting side, maybe you don't have the in-house time or people. And so what we do is we perform, custom labor market analyses. We've done a lot of COVID-19 impact studies. And so we really meet you where you are. Whoever you are, you deserve to have the information you need to help your community thrive and succeed. Excellence is our top priority. We pride ourselves in our high quality data. And the reason that's so important is so that you can make better decisions. So now a few logistics before I introduce our speakers. A lot of you are already engaging in the chat, and that is great. Please type your questions over there in the chat, and I will collect them and then ask Chris and Greg at the end ask your questions. Also, at the end of this webinar, you will get a slide deck and a recording of the presentation. So if you do experience technical difficulties or want to forward this webinar to a colleague who would find it interesting, you will be able to do so. And one final logistics thing, again, we believe you deserve to stay updated on the economy. And so we offer for free a weekly economic update, which unpacks, our most recent issue unpacked the Q3 2020 data on, employment numbers, on, interest rates. And so if you would like to receive that every weekend for free, please type your email in the chat and we will make sure that you get it. Now, with all of that logistics stuff aside, I'm going to introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Chris Chmura. If you've been attending our webinars, you've heard her speak on the economy, which she's been doing since, well, for decades, but especially since COVID, she's been hosting these webinars. She's a blue chip economist, which means she is one of very few people who provide economic, highly reputed economic forecasts. She is also the founder of Chmura and is a thought leader on labor economics. And today she is joined by Greg Chmura, who is Chmura's Chief Quality Officer. And I'm really excited to introduce Greg today because he oversees our data governance department, which is in charge of the modeling and quality assurance of our data sets, especially those in JobsEQ. Greg has been instrumental in developing the COVID-19 Economic Vulnerability Index, which a lot of you may have downloaded from our website, as well as analyzing which jobs can be worked remotely for our remote work index. And today he's also going to talk about our alternative COVID forecast in JobsEQ, something we're very excited about because it incorporates our economic forecasts that take COVID into account. It incorporates that in the JobsEQ tool, which is something no one else has. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris for a national economic update. And again, please put your questions in the end. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Avery. So as Avery said, I'll be talking about the national part, and Greg will come on and talk about skills. So I'll be showing you some charts on all of this, but basically pre-COVID, this economy was sound. There was nothing that suggested that we would go into a recession. But when the pandemic spread to the U.S., the recession started in February. Having a vaccine delivered to a wide range of the population is really key to getting back to a fully functioning economy. But I'll show you, even so, we're already starting to see signs of recovery. And then, as we said earlier, Greg will be following up and talking to you about the skills that are needed during the pandemic and how that has changed. So first, with the U.S. economy. So there's a group, and typically across the globe, we define a recession as 2 consecutive quarterly declines in GDP. That's the broadest indicator of economic activity. But here in the U.S., the National Bureau of Economic Research has within it a business cycle dating committee that looks at all the monthly data. GDP is quarterly, and they determine when a recession has begun and when it ends. So these are some of the indicators on this page that they look at. They look at several others as well. But you can see the gray shaded areas are recessions. Employment, as soon as we got to February, dropped off. In fact, we lost all the jobs that we had created over the past recovery. And then you see now we're seeing it come back. Half the jobs have come back, but the rate of growth is slowing. I'll talk more on that in a bit. On the right-hand side, consumption, that is consumer spending on services and goods, is extremely important to the economy. It makes up about 70% of GDP. When we went into the lockdown, you see this huge drop in consumption or spending, but you see over the past couple of months through September, it's come back up a lot faster than many economists expected. That's very good for the economy. Income, on the other hand, spiked when we went into the recession. And the reason for that is because of the unemployment insurance increase that was given through the CARES Act, the additional $600 a week for those unemployed, as well as the sum of money that was given to each household coming out of the CARES Act. So it spiked, but we're back down to around 5% growth from a year ago, which is a very good growth rate for year over year in the economy. Another factor at the bottom that they look at or series is industrial production, which is the output of manufacturing goods, utilities, and mining. And you could see it dropped off significantly going into the recession, but it's come back. The last month, it dropped. It was a little lower than the year-over-year gain, the index dropped a bit, but still, we're still seeing some fairly good growth. And this drop was mainly due to vehicle manufacturing. When we look at GDP, the broadest indicator of activity, here's the last recession. Here's the first quarter of this year, off 5%, off more than 20%, nearly 30% in the second quarter. And the third quarter number came in just a week or so ago, up 31% annualized gain. So, even though this drop, this rebound is greater than this drop, we're still looking for the whole year of 2020, a slight decline of around 3% in GDP. But the fourth quarter and on, we're looking for about 5% growth. Anything above 2 to 2.5% is considered very good. Now, some of this growth in the fourth quarter is on the assumption that consumers, we still have some very good momentum going and that they're going to continue to spend, and that we'll see something in the way of another stimulus package coming out of Congress sometime soon. So we all disagree. We have different assumptions, we economists, on terms of how fast it's going to continue to grow and when we get to pre-COVID levels. But the one thing that we've all agreed on is that this recession will be sharp, it will be short, and it won't be sustained. So you already see second quarter was down. Third quarter, sometime in the third quarter is probably when they'll call that the recession has ended. Which month, we're not sure, but oftentimes it takes a while for the NBER to call when a recession ends, because they want to make sure the numbers are finished being revised so that they can give us a solid month of when the recession ends. But clearly it will be sometime in the third quarter. So as I said earlier, the economic recovery, coming fully to a recovery, is dependent on the vaccine. And this is, you'll see it more on the employment side when I show you those data. And we've been talking about the 11 or more vaccine candidates that are in phase 3 trial here in the U.S., 7 of them being funded in part by the U.S. Each study has at least 30,000 people. And one of the issues, it usually takes 5 to 10 years to get a vaccine. Here it is within 1 year, and we've already got 11 potentials. And then once you have the vaccine, it takes time to manufacture it and to distribute it. Well, since the government, HHS, Health and Human Services, and Department of Defense announced agreements with Moderna and other firms like Pfizer, that they are starting to have been manufacturing the product already on the assumption that the vaccine, if it's good, then it will be ready to deliver to Americans with a goal of delivery by year end. And of course, all of you have probably heard that Pfizer announced on the 9th that they have a vaccine, 90% effective. Why is that important? Well, as a baseline, flu vaccines are basically between 40 and 60% effective. So 90%, much better than what many people were thinking. So now what needs to happen? Well, the FDA requires 2 months of monitoring for side effects. And that monitoring has already been happening with Pfizer. They say that they will have 2 months of safety data by the 3rd week of November. So from that perspective, they expect FDA to approve it once they give that data to them, with the expectation that they'll start distributing it this month or next month. And then how quickly is it effective? 2 doses are required, but it's effective 28 days after the initial vaccine. They're expecting to produce 50 million doses in 2020. As a point of reference, there are 323 million people in the United States, but this is not the only vaccine that will become available this year or next year, is the expectation. And then in 2021, they're expecting to manufacture 1.3 billion doses. The piece of uncertainty here remains, how long will the protection from the vaccine last? And the reason why they don't know that is because they've just been administering this vaccine on a testing basis over the past 4 or 5 months. So they only have a few months worth of data. But in any case, this is terrific news, suggesting to us that this economy is going to get back on track, maybe sooner than some people had thought. So even so, we don't know how quickly it's going to be distributed across the U.S. And so we still have 3 scenarios, and in terms of when does employment come back. And the way to read this is that we've indexed it relative to the 4th quarter of 2019. So what was employment pre-COVID? And then we look at the change over time. So again, the way to read this here is that by 2 quarters, the baseline being 100, we were down 5% of all jobs, another quarter down 10%. So these are actual data. This is actual data as well. So right now we're only on average for all jobs down about 7-8% from pre-COVID levels. So our 3 different scenarios. The orange one in the middle is moderate, and when you look at what you see in JobsEQ that Greg will talk about later, and in terms of the industry forecast I'll show you in a minute, we're going off this moderate scenario. So here we're assuming that we have a vaccine widely distributed in the 2nd quarter of 2021, no further shutdowns. We get to pre-COVID levels 2 to 3 quarters later, which would be early to mid 2022. This fast scenario would be that the vaccine is widely distributed by the 1st quarter of 2021, which at this point seems to be a stretch. In that case, employment would be to pre-COVID levels in the 2nd quarter of 2021. And then the scenario where we see the slowest comeback in terms of employment is a vaccine not coming out until widely distributed, that is, until the 4th quarter of 2022. We assume some heightened infection either this year or next and a slow recovery. So employment not coming back until 2023. So those are 3 scenarios, but we're going on this middle one for the time being. So just to put this into perspective, when we look at the last two recessions, those of you especially in workforce and even economic development or in general, remember it being a jobless recovery. So here you see employment going down. It really took 4 years until we got to the previous peaks. Same thing with the 2000 recession, pretty much a jobless recovery in that it took about 4 years before we got to the previous peaks. So why are we being so optimistic about the current COVID recession bouncing back more quickly? Well, first of all, here's the decline and here's the rebound. We are already, the last two recessions, it took 2 years to recover half the loss. So 2 years to get half the loss, 4 years to get all of the employment loss back. In this current recession, we've already recovered half of what we lost in terms of employment. Now, we're not expecting the rest of the year to be as fast as the previous one was, but we're still expecting to see some pretty good gains. And this was not your typical recession. So typically when we go in a recession, there are imbalances in the economy. That is, we have too much offices being built, as we did about 20, 30 years ago. And as a result, it takes 2 or 3 years to build an office. If you're at the start of building an office and you have all these empty offices, then you have all this inventory to sell before you get back to an imbalance. So we had no imbalances. As you saw on the previous charts, this was an economy that was looking good, was strong, and there's no widespread deflation in any sectors. Remember, our last recession was housing related. We saw housing prices going down year over year. And as a result, people were saying, why buy a $300,000 house when I could wait another 6 months and it'll be only $280,000 or $270,000? So we're not seeing any widespread deflation that would cause people to delay their spending on goods. So this is not your typical recession. So we don't expect the rebound in terms of employment to be typical either. We expect it to be bit faster. But then some people would say, well, during a recession, we see all these productivity gains going on because you see a shift from labor to more productive means. You see businesses who are trying to increase profits, and so they find ways to save money by maybe not employing as many people. So that's the downside, but we believe some of that would be offset with when we get people back to work. The jury is out on how productive people are being at home, but some of them would be more productive at work. The other thing is some businesses are not hiring right now as much as they would like to because it's hard to bring people on board. It's hard to communicate a culture when you have people working from home instead of in the same building with each other. So before I show the employment numbers, let me ask a question. Avery, I think you have a question related to, and I'm trying to get a sense of how safe we're all starting to feel, because again, we need to feel safe before we go out and really spend like we did in the past. So Avery, could you ask the question that we might have queued up for now?
Yes. So the question is, and you'll see it published just now, is how many days have you stayed in a hotel over the past 3 months? And we have a few follow-up questions as well. So I'll just give everyone a few more seconds to answer. And just as things start to come in, I remember we asked this question a month or two ago, and almost no one had been in a hotel. But now, it looks like most people have answered. We've got 73% still saying have not been in a hotel for the past 3 months. But we've got 20% saying 1 to 5 days. So that's a change. Chris, anything you want to say to that, or I can roll to the next one?
That is interesting that it's up to 20%, but 73%, that's a huge amount. So yes, now the next question is
was it for business or for vacation? If you stayed in a hotel. And I see Anne in the chat has said her screen still says start the broadcast, just hit play. All right. And now, again, a similar change, ending the poll. We've got, when we asked this a month ago, almost everyone who had stayed in a hotel was there for vacation. And now we've still got 78% for vacation, but 21% of people are staying in a hotel for business.
Interesting. Yeah. So nice to see some progress there in terms of people feeling that they can get out, or maybe business is doing better, and that's why from the business side. We'll ask you a similar question about airline travel, but we'll wait a little while to do that. So now, when we looked at that previous chart that showed you employment decline in the U.S. and when do we get back to pre-COVID levels, here we're now doing it by industry. And so these are the major industry sectors, and again, indexed to 100 when previous to COVID happening. And what this is showing you is that red, arts, accommodation and food services saw the largest decline in terms of job losses. And next to that, arts and entertainment. And you see accommodation and food services coming back a bit quicker than arts and entertainment, getting back to pre-COVID levels here in the 2022 timeframe. Now I'm just peeling back and showing you some other industries. So I took the largest ones dropping away. And in red, we're now looking at mining and quarrying. And part of this shape is probably due to the gasoline prices and oil prices in terms of their comeback. But the dark orangish butterscotch here is showing you other services, which would be things like barbers, salons, photographers, and in blue, administrative support and waste management services, what this is called. That would be support services for buildings such as landscaping and janitorial. And now peeling away again, we're looking at retail trade coming back and pretty much staying at 97% of total, because as we look at a long-term trend there with some of the shifts toward online purchases, we don't expect that to get back to pre-COVID levels. In blue here, we're looking at the information industry. Didn't decline as much, in part because computer related, some of this is media, could be doing some work from home, so not as many people laid off. And then now finally, education services. Notice that when we get to pre-COVID levels, it does continue to grow. Similarly, professional, scientific, and again, this one didn't drop off as much because a lot of those individuals, accounting, lawyers, consultants, could be computer related, can be working from home. And then the purple here is showing you healthcare. And again, notice once we get beyond COVID, healthcare continues to grow in terms of employment, mostly because of the demographics and the baby boomers that are aging. So the COVID-19 crisis then, this crisis will end and the recovery has already begun. So that's good to see that those data coming in. The national economic outlook, sharp and short, not sustained. The vaccine widely available in 2021 is what we're expecting, which is great news. And that means employment reaching pre-COVID levels, again, is dependent on the vaccine being widely available, but we would expect that in early to mid 2022. And then finally, this may be on everyone's mind, but it does appear that we will have a new administrative change. And how much we see the new administration affect policy will depend on who has control over the Senate. And again, we still don't have an answer on that, given the Georgia elections that are still going off, or the runoffs that are going on in a couple of months. With the new administration, the Biden administration, he has talked about taxes, tax increases. He's talked about increasing the Affordable Care Act, increasing regulation. He's got a climate change agenda. Some of those items, and particularly regulation, tend to have a dampening effect on the economy. So our forecast did not take into account administrative changes. So at this point, We may see a bit slower growth, maybe 3 or 4 quarters out. But if the Senate is not Democratic, then we would expect not to see as many changes happening and impacting the economy. So with that, let me just remind you again that as Avery said, that we have the weekly economic impact that we're glad to send you on a weekly basis. Here's kind of what it looks like with summary of what came out last week, some explanation of what the numbers mean, some of what the interest rates look like, and maybe what the Fed has said, how that will affect the economy, then our forecasts and some of the financial numbers. So before I hand it over to Greg, Avery, do you mind asking the question about airline travel?
Yes. So not that one. The question is, have you flown on a plane since March 2020? You can go ahead and answer that right there. And also, just as a note, Chris and Greg, we have a lot of really great questions coming in. So we'll want to make sure we spend some time on those at the end. All right. Have you flown on a plane since March 2020? 82% say no. 17% yes. And so then the related question, if you were on a plane, why? Was it for business or was it for a vacation? And that poll is up right now. Okay, it looks like 88% for vacation. It looks like people are more frequently staying in a hotel for business than they are flying for business.
That's interesting. Before I hand it over to Greg, so I did see a study recently that said that you're safer on an airplane than you are eating at a restaurant.
Oh boy.
So I don't know how much scientific background or surveying went into that, but in any case, it's good to see that there are some people that are both feel safe enough to go to hotels as well as to travel by airlines. So with that, let me hand it back to Greg.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So in this next section, we're going to be looking at the impacts that COVID has been having on the economy, and we're going to be using some job ads to do that, and we're going to dive down into some occupation and some skill changes. So first, looking at it broadly, here's the number of job ads, so new online job ads that were posted in the United States according to the month they were posted. And you can see here in February, about 2.5 million before the lockdown occurred. We had a really sharp decline in March and April, so a 38% decline, reaching bottom here in April. Then the trend back up was pretty slow. It took us all the way to August before we rebounded to where we were back in February. Since August, we came down a little bit, but this is nothing to be worried about because it's basically a seasonal pattern. Now, more recently, the last couple of weeks, we were down a little bit lower than we were expected. We'll have to keep watching that to see if we are starting to turn down a little bit more as more the COVID spread seems to have picked up a little bit, but we'll have to keep an eye on that. So that's the big picture here. Now, when we drill down a little bit and look by these occupation groups, here we're seeing the trend again. The orange dotted line here is the overall trend. The blue line up top, these would be the blue collar workers. And you could see what happened here. They all declined kind of at the average pace, but then they rebounded much stronger than average. And blue collar includes your transportation workers. And they did really well, since COVID with all the delivery kind of services happening. So they rebounded really strongly there. In the orange line here, we have services. And we can see that they declined more than anybody else. So an additional 10% or so. Services includes your food prep, your hairdressers, childcare, things of that nature. Those have rebounded stronger than average. So after that April decline, they came above the average line here and have been a little bit higher than average. So kind of making up for lost ground there. They had more job ads in May and those following months compared to overall. Now the gray line here, this was surprising when we first noted this. So the gray line is the white collar workers. So they're very average through April. Then after April on the rebound, they were slower than average, and they stayed slower than average. And even today, they're slower than average, which is kind of surprising because usually we see faster job growth, more demand, higher demand for white collar jobs. So that was very curious to see. But digging into what happened here, we see that there were fewer separations in that group. So these are separations data for 2020, comparing the change compared to 2019. And January and February were pretty normal. In March, we had this huge spike because of all the layoffs. So the blue line here is overall. The orange line is the financial sector. The gray line is professional and business services. And in those sectors where you have a lot of white collar workers, the amount of layoffs were smaller. All right. And then we had fewer layoffs in April, but still more than average. Now, once we got to May and beyond, an interesting thing happened. All of the lines here are below normal, meaning there's fewer separations. So what's happening, or what was happening, was that fewer people were leaving their jobs for one reason or another. And a lot of that has to do with fewer people quitting. And that's what we see here in the next slide. In January and February, so the January line is the 2019. The orange line is 2020. And so in January and February, we were started off about on par. Once the lockdowns hit, and since then, the rate of quits have been lower in 2020 compared to 2019. So from March through August, we averaged in 2019 2.75% for quits. In 2020, it was on 2.12%. So a lot of fewer people are quitting. And that's more pronounced in various sectors. So, for example, financial sector, fewer people are quitting there. So, fewer people leaving jobs, especially those white collar workers. So, there's less of a need to replace them. So, there's less of a need to put job ads out there to try to replace them. So, those declines that we were seeing in job ads continuing, since the recovery from the trough. Part of that is due to just not needing to replace people who aren't leaving their current positions. But also, there is the hesitancy to expand if there's uncertainty. So we have both of those factors going on there. And one final slide here before I move into the next section. Here's the unemployment rate by your major occupation groups. So we have 20 plus groups along here, the bottom. And you could see here the March numbers and the April numbers, and the big increase in the unemployment rate as we went from one month to the next. Some of the biggest unemployment in personal care and service, so personal care, hairdressers, barbers, childcare workers, and so forth. Food prep and serving related, a lot of unemployment there as well. Here we have the blue collar jobs here, so production, transportation, some increases there, sizable increases. White collar workers over here on the left-hand side, some increases, but not as much. Education was up a lot, and even in healthcare. So even though healthcare, we're going to see some growth in demand in certain cases, there were job losses in the middle there. So right here you have the 6% and 11%, excuse me, these are the two healthcare occupation groups. So they saw some layoffs, and unemployment is looking at those occupation groups again. And here we're going to be comparing, and for the next group of slides, a 6-month period, May through October of 2020. And we're going to take a look at all the ads in that period compared to May through October of 2019. So it's comparing those two 6-month periods. The 2020 period is basically kind of like post-COVID. And by that, I mean not that COVID is over, but after COVID hit. And with May, we're basically on the rebound already after a lot of the lockdowns were wrapping up. And we're comparing how did the ads look in that period versus how they looked in 2019. And this will give us some information about how things have changed, how things are different right now. And they might give us some indication, some of these changes might stay permanent. So earlier, Chris mentioned with retail, not expecting it to come back fully because of more online shopping. So there could be some hints of things to come and that might stick around in the future as well as we look at these trends. Okay, so the first trend we're going to look at here is within the management occupation group. And the purple bar here, right here, is what happened in management. So overall, they declined 16%. So that means the number of ads in the 6-month period in 2020 was 16% lower than it was back in 2019. Now, management, there's a lot of variation. There are some winners and losers as far as who did better than average. In this group, we have sales managers, marketing managers, general managers, all sorts of different engineering managers, all sorts of different types. One of the types that did better than average was the medical manager, so that's not too surprising. So a lot of demand for medical. Who did worse than average? A big one that jumps out here is the education administrators, post-secondary. 43% drop, which is a pretty big decline. And now we have a poll question for this, Avery, if you could pull it up. So a lot of you are working in colleges or universities. And for those of you who are, we're interested what you're seeing in your institution.
Yes, so for those of you who work at colleges or university, has your institution made cutbacks to administration positions? All right, we're seeing some of the results coming in. And also, everyone, if you lose sound for any reason, the sound on our end is fine. So just click the red reconnect button at the top, and that will reconnect you with sound. And since we will be sending the slide deck and a recording later today, if you missed a few seconds, you can always go back and listen to that. All right, so the results from the poll, we have 41% of people say, yes, we've made cutbacks to admin positions. 48% say, no, we're about the same. 2% say we've actually been growing, and 7% don't know.
Wow, so that's really interesting. I wasn't expecting that number to be so close. So 43% we're showing here on the slide, and 41% of you had said you made a cutback. So that's
wow.
Yeah, very interesting correspondence.
Yeah,
because some of this too may not necessarily be cutbacks, but like I said, it could be due to people not leaving their positions as much less churn. But in this case, it seems pretty close based on that poll.
And Lori says, we're not filling positions, or we're delaying hiring. So
Yep, a lot of delays. So yep, makes sense. Okay, very good. The next group I'm going to look at are the computer occupations. As we look at the skills specifically, that information security was really a growing demand due to the changes with COVID and people needing to work remotely from home. On the negative side, though, in this group, web developers, a lot bigger decline than average. Community and social service. So here we have our social workers, caseworkers, and so forth. Not a happy picture here, actually, and there's the CDC, they did a survey, and there's a report that they put out that, mental health conditions, unfortunately, they worsened after COVID struck, just with the lockdowns and so forth, increased substance abuse too. So that necessitated the need for those workers here. Within healthcare, so I've got two groups, the healthcare practitioners and technical, and the healthcare support, and I got them both on the same slide. So they both grew about 10 and 12% respectively. Who did better than average in that group? Well, the nurses did, LPNs especially, 43%, nursing assistants, RNs, medical assistants, they all did better than average. One group that did worse than average, there were a few occupations that did worse than average. And one of them especially was physical therapists. So they got hit really bad, 41% drop in job ads. And there was also a link. I wrote a blog recently. We put it up, and included a link to a report with physical therapists. So for 72% of physical therapy practice owners, they had a revenue loss at some point this year. The first line supervisors, minus 10%, they were a little bit better than average too. You might be expecting to see waiters and waitresses in this worse than average grouping. And I didn't, who got hit really hard were the maids and the housekeeping cleaners. And this kind of goes along with accommodations being hit hard, so that kind of makes sense there. Personal care and service occupations, they were hit very badly, minus 39% as a group, and especially bad those child care workers and nannies, minus 51, minus 63%. So really big declines there. Office and admin support, they were down 27%. The medical secretary is not so bad, but your other secretaries, pretty bad. Executive secretaries, especially bad. And you see a few of the other ones, the bookkeeping clerks, the hotel clerks, all worse than average. Finally, on the good side here, the transportation and material moving, they were up as a group 9%. That includes some of your warehouse workers. So the laborers and freight, stock and material movers hand. So the people, moving things around by hand in the warehouse or using pallet jacks, up 37%. So, perhaps a shift that will be somewhat permanent as far as some of those retail jobs moving into, a different means of delivering goods using warehouses and so forth. So we have those laborers up, and also the stockers and order fillers, that occupation was up as well. So, excuse me, with all of these occupation shifts, there's going to be, skill shifts in the labor force overall, but also we could drill down and look at specific skills within specific occupations. And that's what I have in the next section here. In each of these, we looked at changes of combinations of skills and occupations, and where we've seen increases, again, in the same 6-month period, May through October of this year versus last year, to see where we've been seeing some significant changes. And all these changes, too, are significant beyond just the change at the occupation level. These were percent changes within the occupation as well. Some of these changes are going to be very unsurprising or mundane, and that's kind of this first slide. But other ones will be more interesting and maybe surprising for some of you. So in this first slide, we're looking at transportation. Not surprising that we've seen, okay, we have more people out there doing transportation with delivery vans, needing food service skills, and needing smartphones for logistical purposes, right? So we've, all of us, I think, have experienced having that Amazon van, in our neighborhood, and its familiar backing up sound, right? So definitely a change that's happened there, and we're seeing numbers changing in the job ads because of that. In the medical field, some of these things we're seeing are probably more likely than not due to COVID. Other changes may not be due to COVID, but there's still the changes that are in these 2-year comparison time frames. So we're seeing more infection control skills needed. Also, you see the long-term care increase for those types of skills. Also interesting to see that not only with nurses, but speech-language pathologists who are helping COVID patients recover, medical and health service managers, they all need to know more about long-term care. So a lot of increases in that skill needed. Sterilization, again, that's not surprising and likely due to COVID, as more workers need to know about how to sterilize equipment and so forth. Also, FDA regulations with the medical managers needing to know about that. Here in the computer area, we have 2 slides. One is first with the computer security and networking. So a lot of increases needed in skills here around that. So we have, as more workers are working from home, we need to make sure that's secure. So cybersecurity is an increase in a number of different computer occupations. Information security, same thing. Network security, same kind of thing. We have to keep those networks secure, even though since we have our workers all over the place rather than just at the office. How are our workers dialing in, well, they're using VPN to connect to their office computers. So we need an increase in managing that skill, again, with our security analysts, making sure that those connections are all secure, and web servers. So we have to make sure that everything here is locked down. That's, again, the information security analysts, more need for that skill. Also, with computer occupations, there was a big increase in cloud computing skills needed. Two of them I'm calling out here: Amazon Web Services. See all these at the top for a number of different occupations. And then Microsoft Azure for a number of occupations as well. Now this one, actually looking at it, both of these skills were on the increase even before COVID. So looking at 2018 to 2019, these two were on the rise already. So some of this increase may have been happening anyway. Some of it may be also accelerated or partially due to COVID, but just so you have that information, it was increasing already, and really it continued to increase here. So in choosing these slides, I was choosing certain combinations that really popped out, and these were some of them that really popped out at me. Now, with those tech-related changes, we have ripple effects into sales and other sales-related occupations, marketing, and support services. So they need to know how to work with and sell certain things. So Amazon Web Services, we need to know about that. So marketing managers and sales representatives of services, sales people who sell services, they need to know about Amazon Web Services. Okay, local LAN software, the sales reps need to know about that. Microsoft Azure, not only the sales reps, but the marketing managers, the sales managers, they all need to know about that as they start promoting that and working with it more, since that skill is growing on the tech side. Routers, so more people are dialing in from home. We have more people selling routers apparently, and servicing routers, customer service reps, taking those support calls for people who are buying routers and using routers. Telecommunications, maybe we need more fiber for our connections. We have more sales reps needing to know about that, and the supervisors and the engineers, and then VPN software for the sales engineers. So a lot of those technical skills more important among these sales and related occupations. Then we have here we have a few certifications. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. Some of these, again, kind of not too surprising. Among food occupations, there's certifications that are less found in the 2020 ads because they're dealing with them less. So the Serve Safe Food Protection Manager, so we're seeing less of those requirements in ads because they're less needed there. And this Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission certification, even despite its name, it's not used only in Texas, used in some other states as well. But among bartenders and waitresses, the requirement for that certification is dropped in 2020. We've seen some increases in some certifications, though. Here in healthcare, we have some infection control certifications right here in the middle, some increases there. And then there's a few other that listed here. And again, you'll have access to this slide deck afterwards. Avery will give you access so you can look at these as you like. Some of these, again, may have been moving a little bit before COVID, but you see some increases in this time frame nevertheless. Here we see some related certifications to those skills that we saw earlier. So cloud security professionals, right, related to those cloud services for information security analysts. So a big increase in requirements for that certification. CompTIA security practitioner. So for your network and computer systems admin people, an increase in CompTIA security certifications there. Okay, so that's it for the skills part. I want to just go quickly through just a few slides regarding the forecast. So kind of jumping back up to where Chris was, talking a bit about that forecast and the alternate forecast and how you could use that in JobsEQ. And also for those, even if you don't have JobsEQ, I'm just a kind of a long-term versus short-term forecast comparison. So in JobsEQ, we have this tool, the forecast comparison. Here you can see the historical employment change, the drop due to the second quarter of this year, and then the long-term forecast. This is all 4-quarter average to smooth it out. And this is a long-term forecast. So basically, we're just showing the trend. We're expecting the trend back up over the long term over the next 10 years. Okay. Now, we can have an alternative forecast right here in black, showing that we're going to kind of rebound, not just kind of take off from where we left off, but rebound somewhat. And 10 years from now, we'll end up more closer to where we were headed rather than having a permanent shift. All right. Now, if you don't have JobsEQ, maybe you use the long-term forecast from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for your expectations as far as what occupations we're going to need in the future, right? So that occupation demand. Now, occupation demand is related to occupation openings, which is kind of similar to job openings, but a little bit different. So job openings happens anytime someone leaves a job. An occupation opening only happens when people move from one occupation to another or just leave that occupation. It's important if we're in education or workforce to know about occupation openings, because that tells us how many people we need to train in our region for certain jobs. So how many nurses do we need over the next year? 200 nurses in our county to fill in for those people who left. Well, for our long-term occupation demand, the growth piece of it is really small. The biggest pieces are exits and transfers. So people who retire, those are your exits. People who transfer are people who is a nurse one year, and then the next year they go into education, or maybe they become an administrator. And so those are by far the two biggest pieces of occupation demand rather than growth. So if you're wondering, what forecast should I use for my long-term projections of occupation demand, the answer is it probably doesn't matter too much, because those separation pieces are really going to be the bigger drivers of the demand numbers. Now the COVID forecast, though, what is that useful for? Well, that's more useful for that short-term impact. So here in JobsEQ, we have this down for all of your industries. You can run it for every region. Here I have it quarter to quarter. So the quarterly data here, you can see our sharp decline in the second quarter, and now we see the faster than average rebound that Chris was showing us. Then we see the seasonality bopping around there as we go forward. So we could run this in this case for the USA. This is other services. We could also choose California or any other region that you want, and then you can see specifically for your region, how that rebound is going to look. Now, in this case, our rebound assumptions are that you're going to rebound in a similar manner to the US. And, regionally, you maybe didn't decline as much or maybe decline further. So there might be a little bit of variation there. But generally, it does allow you to take, okay, what happened locally? If we follow this faster than average track, how quickly are we going to rebound? So you can see here at the industry level what to expect recovery-wise for your industries. And right here, I have a 2-digit industry, but in JobsEQ, you could run that at the 4-digit level. And then you could also put together graphs like this that compare different industry growth rates, where you see some accommodation and food rebounding more slowly compared to others that maybe didn't decline at all, or others that are going to just come back a lot faster. So you could look at those variations as well. Okay, let me stop there because I think we're getting close on time, and I think we've got some good questions.
Yes, Chris, I sent those to you. So do you want to choose one to answer?
Sure, I'll pick a couple of these. And for those of you who have to drop off at 1, thanks for attending with us. We'll continue to do this as it's useful and we get more information. And please be safe. For the rest of you who can stay online, we'll continue to answer questions until no more come in. So I'll start with one at the bottom. Many have suggested that the pandemic would lead to worsening income inequality. Could you comment on this, please? And the answer is yes, we've seen that. And actually, Greg wrote a great blog on remote workers, and it kind of really brings that out. And so I'm going to, you can go to our blog. But what we did is we looked at what occupations could work remotely based on survey data from BLS and Census. And we grouped them into can work remote, can work sometimes remote, and cannot work remote. And then we looked at the industries they were associated with. We looked at ethnicity of those, for example, who could work remotely. So, and I'm not going to get this totally correct, but you can look at the blog and I'll get it directionally correct. So maybe 77% or so of all workers are white, about a little larger percent, about the same percentage. Greg, could you just give us a number up, because I know I'm wrong on that one?
Yeah, let me pull it up here while you.
Yeah, I put the blog in the chat as well.
Yeah.
So Greg can just keep it there.
But the important thing is, so a larger percentage of the population who are white are in remote jobs. A very small percentage who are black, about 7%, are in all jobs. A smaller percentage in remote jobs. It's just the opposite with Asian. That is, more Asian background are in remote jobs than total jobs overall. But the bigger point is that the majority of jobs that are remote require a 2-year degree or higher. And when we look at then the ethnicity, that explains a good bit of why there has been disparity. Clearly, when you think about low-skilled jobs, those are jobs where you have to interact with people. You have to be at the restaurant. You have to be at the grocery store. And with the remote jobs that pay higher wages are more office jobs, computer-related, consulting, that pay higher wages. So that's why, yes, we do expect that there is some worsening income inequality during this pandemic. And then you could go to that blog. Another one, is a vaccine needed for the economic recovery, or would an effective treatment do the same? I think an effective treatment will get us a long way, but we really do need a vaccine, because if you've known anyone who's gotten the virus, some people get through it easily, other people end up in a hospital, and it's not clear to what degree they're going to have issues with their lungs going forward. So clearly, I think those people, especially at risk, are going to need to see a vaccine before they feel comfortable. So that'll be a good proportion of our population. Is there one for Greg Avery, or should I continue on here?
The question for Greg was, for all of the slides you were showing with the increase in job ads from 2019 to 2020, is there some sort of multiplier that we should include there, or is it just 1,000 more jobs ask for whatever certification?
Right. So when we're showing those raw numbers,
yes,
yeah, those were overall for the U.S.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then another question for Greg is, what are the sources for the forecast's projected demand for transfers and exits? Where do transfers and exits come from?
Right. So that's part of the BLS long-term forecast. They also have these separation rates. And so they have that broken down for your detailed occupations as far as, what they're expecting for those exits and those transfers. So it's broken down to the very detailed occupations. And when you sum them all up, those were those overall numbers that I was showing there, that, that predominantly the demand is through those separations rather than the growth piece.
Okay, here's one I've got. How much will empty commercial real estate, due to the companies moving to remote work, affect the economy? I have to think cities full of empty commercial in the press. When I've actually seen numbers on what percentage of firms are going to go to full-time remote, it's surprisingly low, in the single digits. And clearly, in some areas such as San Francisco, that'll have a bigger impact than others. But even this is very fluid, and Microsoft, for example, has announced that for those remote workers that go outside of San Francisco or wherever they are right now to someplace else, they're going to adjust their pay. So it may be, 20% cheaper to be in Iowa, Des Moines, Iowa, than to be in San Francisco. But if a firm hires a lot of people out of that MSA, they're going to reduce their salary by that amount, or the salary won't be as high. So I think it's too soon to call what impact this will have on commercial real estate. Like I said before, how do you build a culture when everyone's working remotely? I think In another year or two, we'll see, I believe, more coming back to offices than one might expect given the current trends. Do you predict that jobs will return at first part-time with the expectation that part-time assignments will grow into full-time, or rather than full-time? If they offer first part-time, do you think it is an effort by companies not to offer benefits or reduce restart benefits? That always happens during a recession. Coming out of a recession, you're not as confident, business owners or managers are not as confident that their demand will continue for their good or service. And so from that perspective, yes, they hire part-time workers. As the economy continues to grow, then they turn those workers into full-time. And part of that may be an effort to keep costs low, but certainly making sure that demand remains strong is the biggest factor that is causing hiring part-time instead of full-time. And then could you also discuss the possible understated unemployment rate, since it's based on those actively seeking employment, not accounting for reduced hours? How can we better gauge what we need to prepare for? The unemployment claim numbers don't necessarily paint the same picture. So yeah, the unemployment claim numbers, this morning, every Thursday, they come out and have been coming down. But you're correct, the unemployment rate's probably understating, because if you're not actively seeking a job, you're not counted. But the other factor is that we probably have some people who are near retirement or at risk who have decided not to come back into the labor market. So from that perspective, the labor force participation rate has come down and it's been slow to go back up. But if you would look at the U6, so that's the unemployment rate that takes into account people who are working part-time but rate. I believe that's it on my questions, Avery, unless you're seeing something else coming in.
Yes, we do have some more. Either Greg or Chris, have you done any research related to how the self-employed are doing during COVID-19?
I'll maybe Greg could say something on self-employed. I'm not sure, but it's interesting that when we went into this pandemic and the shutdown, the number of new startups dropped dramatically. But over the past couple of months, new startups are actually on track, moving from full-time to gig work. Well, it depends what the gig type work is. If we're talking about like Uber and that type of thing, people still are not feeling safe enough to get into a car with someone. So I think that would be dependent on the type of work, and is social distancing able to happen?
Workforce development boards, private sector, what would you recommend is a good first step for preparing your local workforce?
I would say all of the above. Certainly finding out from firms, then based on that, you can look at what type of people are graduating from the local higher ed or community, the providers, to make sure that those skill gaps are closed.
Great, thanks. And I think we'll do one more question before we sign off.
The private sector was up almost 1 million jobs. We saw a couple 100,000 jobs lost in government, partially due to the census ending. But we saw the unemployment rate drop while the participation rate rose. So that means that